Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Wes for inviting me. Dr. Spitzer, thank you for the wonderful presentation beforehand. As I told him, it's ending with Kierkegaard, who I love as a philosopher and as a Christian, as a theologian, really sets the bar high. So I'm going to do my best to try to somehow give you something as tasty as what you just had, but and give me a lot of thoughts. And my brothers and sisters in Christ, thank you very much. It is so good to be here with all of you, to be with fellow travelers in this journey of trying to be the people that God has called us to be. Just a brief, talk about shameless self-promotion, just a brief little bit about myself. I'm a born and raised American Baptist. Grew up in Albany, New York. Went to Oberlin College and then to Potsdam State and got a degree in music, which is very useful for many things. Not much. And then went to Andover Newton for seminary, and then I served the church in Dayton, Ohio, First Baptist Church of Dayton. I was the associate pastor there for 5 years. And now I've been at Lower Merion Baptist Church in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. I've been there for 4 years, and I'll share a little bit about that story. I'm currently working on my doctoral studies at the University of Dayton in Baptist theology. If you can imagine, there is such a thing as Baptist theology. I want to bring you through the story that the church that I serve right now is experiencing. And it's a story that started 200 years ago. Lower Merion Baptist Church is a 200-year-old church. So, I know this is a baby church in our perspective. And it's a story that I think it's probably one that you can relate to as well. So 200 years old. Have you ever heard of Bullard's Life Cycles of the Church? He basically, I'm going to give the very brief I'm not going to give all the details of it because it's not that important for this. It's an interesting model. But basically he says, a church starts with a kind of vision, works its way up, and then it starts to go down again. And this is a cycle. Lower Merion Baptist Church started in 1808 with 19 people, with 19 people gathering under revivals and good preaching, and they said, we need to have a Baptist presence here. It was a church plant by Church of the Great Valley, which is a 300-year-old church. But it was people with a real vision and a sense for Christ. It was the first non-Quaker church in that area. So you can imagine that the sense of organization was very loose. They didn't have a board of trustees until 1809. If you can also imagine existing for a whole year without a board of trustees. I mean, what do you do with all the property? They didn't have any, so it didn't matter. And they, in the first 10 years, they managed to kick out at least half of their congregation, and then take back some, and then kick out some others. Good Baptist folks. They started to grow and grow and grow as the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians, just as churches in America continued to grow. And I think around the 1930s they reached this part. Now you could look at the history of the church and argue that there were ups and downs, but in the big picture, the meta story, in the 1930s they reached a peak when things were really, the church was full every Sunday. You maybe heard this story with other churches as well. They had to have 2 services. Kids were bussed in for Sunday school. The church is right next to Bryn Mawr College, so Woodrow Wilson would come to worship. He wasn't the president then, so they still thought it was exciting. It was a kind of a golden years of the church. In that time, they did some adding on. They started a construction of a new building. They sold some other land on Route 30, which I still lament today because that land would go for millions of dollars today. But they just were really developing, and institutionally there was a lot of growth. And then there started to be a decline, and this is a decline that I think follows all of Protestant mainline denominations. A decline of, it's still, attendance was still there, the enthusiasm was there, the programs were going well, but something seemed to be missing. And if you went to anybody in these times, this is the 1950s, 1960s, I don't think anyone would say there's been a decline. But if you take a step back, and that's what that quote from Kierkegaard is so great, if you look backwards, you'll find that there tended to be a lack of a focus on Christ in this time, and more of a focus on the church as an institution. And if you really start to look then at the studies, when people start to, when attendance starts to go down in the 70s and then the 80s, I think it starts in the 50s. When you have this, what I call an ideal, the church becomes an idol. And God takes a back seat, And maintaining the church, maintaining the institution becomes the most important thing. I see some head nodding. So this is a story you know as well. This is a story that Lower Merion Baptist certainly did live. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s, they would still say things were going well. And then they had a pastor leave who was a wonderful pastor. Then after that, things tended to explode.